to meet in person. So we're going to call upon Avi to first give us a little briefing through his eyes. I wrote down 5 different topics that can take 5 different months. We have Iran, we have October 7th, we have elections, we have the U.S.-Israel relationship. I'll let him choose how he will brief us, and then we'll ask a few questions, and then we'll go from there. So without further ado, we're really excited to have Avi Mayer.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Marcy, for making the shidduch. And thank you all for your warm hospitality this Shabbat. I really feel like I'm amongst mishpacha, and I really appreciate that. In thinking about the past year, it's obviously been a very challenging year for so many of us. We have experienced things that we perhaps wouldn't have anticipated. We've been subjected to all sorts of abuse that we had thought had been relegated to the past. And it's been a trying year for so many of us and in so many different ways. And for those of us who are in Israel, I think it's perhaps felt most viscerally. This past Simchat Torah, as you know, in Israel, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are observed on the same day. We recited a new Yizkor prayer for the victims of October 7th and of the war. And generally speaking, the way we do this at my Jerusalem synagogue, and we have folks here who have been at my Jerusalem synagogue, is we will have private remembrances for those individuals who are reciting Yizkor for loved ones who have passed, and then we recite several collective ones. I'm sure that's what you do here in other communities as well. And I tend to be the one whose job it is to recite the communal Yizkors, and so I recited the Yizkor for the soldiers of the IDF, the Yizkor for the victims of the Holocaust. And before I recited the next one, I had to pause and sort of collect my emotions. And then I started chanting. And every few moments, I would have to pause, choke back tears, clear my eyes, and power through. And when I finished the Yizkor, I sat in my seat and burst into tears. And I think it was actually the first time in the past year that I actually had a real cry. There'd obviously been many occasions in which tears filled my eyes, but I never sort of allowed myself to have that cathartic moment, and it sort of burst forward on that holiday. And in thinking about what we've all been experiencing over the past year, I'm reminded actually of that exact conversation that was moderated by Rabbi Sherman with my dear friend Rabbi Ari Hasit, in which Ari described the Jewish tradition of Aninut, which is the period after someone has passed away but before their funeral, when their loved ones are essentially exempt from all religious obligations. They're not expected to pray. They're not expected to engage in any active mitzvot, because the rabbis understood that the pain and the trauma are so raw that mourners couldn't be expected to do anything but sit with that pain and that trauma. And Ari said, we as a people are in a state of collective aninut. We haven't even started moving on to the process of post-trauma because we're still mired in the trauma of that day. Because we still have 101 hostages who unthinkably are in Hamas captivity, have entered their 2nd year in bondage. We have tens of thousands of Israelis who haven't seen their homes in a year, if they even still exist. We have hundreds upon hundreds of families who are mourning loved ones who've been killed either on October 7th or during the war. And so we are very much a nation and a society in trauma. And recent weeks have offered some hope. And I mentioned to some folks earlier this week, if I had to give the past month a title, it would be How the IDF Got Its Groove Back. The remarkable operations against the leaders of Hezbollah and Hamas, Hassan Nasrallah and Yahya Sinwar, that eliminated 2 of the most, the wickedest, the most evil people on earth. Truly remarkable. The pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, and then last weekend, the remarkable airstrikes in Iran the scope of which is not fully known, but we understand we hit them and hit them very hard indeed, have given us all this sort of renewed sense of confidence in the IDF and in our institutions that, quite frankly, we had somewhat lost in the aftermath of October 7th. And yet at the same time, as we memorialized at the service earlier, we still have soldiers being killed on a daily basis. The day I flew out this past Sunday, we had 2 funerals taking place just in my neighborhood in Jerusalem of soldiers who had been killed. And something that I actually noticed as the rabbi was reciting the names, many of those who are being killed are officers. They're not quote unquote regular soldiers, although of course some of them are as well. And to me, that's an indication of how these officers are leading their men into battle, and often the ones putting their own lives on the line in order to protect their own troops. And I think that that's incredible. What has sort of kept us afloat over the past year has been the sense of unity that I think many of us have experienced, certainly in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, a country that was on the brink of seeming collapse before October 7th, which many of us will recall, the street protests, the extraordinary debate around the judicial reform in Israel. All of that was replaced by this coming together in a way that I think none of us could have anticipated, and I think none of us had really had experienced before. We had religious and secular Israelis, those on the right and on the left, Jewish Israelis and non-Jewish Israelis, Jews in Israel and around the world coming together to support those who really needed it the most and to support Israel in its time of need. You had non-kosher restaurants in Tel Aviv koshering their kitchens so that they could send meals to troops on the front lines. You had, I think it's worthy of applause. You had Haredi Israelis who would not otherwise have served in the army going through accelerated basic training programs so that they could participate in some way in the war effort. You had Arab Israelis telling pollsters that they felt more Israeli after October 7th than they ever had before. And this sense of national solidarity and unity is, I think, what buttressed us and gave us the ability to weather the storm and make it through the initial part of this war. And coupled with that, and I alluded to this earlier during the service, was the sense of solidarity that we experienced from folks like you and Jews and other allies around the world. I can't tell you how many heart emojis I received during those initial months of folks from all over the world, some of whom were long-lost friends or college classmates who didn't fully understand what I was going through, but understood that my people and I were going through something terrible and just wanted to show their care and love and support. And I know so many Israelis who've received other expressions of support and love and solidarity from folks around the world, and that has given us so much strength and the knowledge that, in fact, we are not alone, although it often does feel so. But the last thing that I've perceived is something that I don't think I would have anticipated. And it was actually something that was prompted by a conversation I had with a group that was visiting, I think, from Houston, Texas. I was giving a briefing about the goings-on in Israel, and a gentleman during the Q&A session raised his hand and said, "Do you feel, Avi, that this is the end of Zionism?" I had this sort of quizzical look on my face. I said, "Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you explain what it is that you're asking?" He said, "Do you feel that young people in Israel will look at the events of October 7th and conclude that it's simply not safe to live in Israel? It's not safe to raise children in a place where the hordes can just come storming through the border and massacring and maiming and kidnapping people and families and taking them to the other side? Do you feel that Israelis of a certain age are just going to give up and leave, and that'll be the end of Zionism?" And it took me a second. I had to collect my thoughts. I really had not anticipated this question. And I said, no, I don't think this is the end of Zionism. I think this is the revitalization of Zionism. And I said, I actually don't think it started on October 7th. I think it started last summer, during those street protests, when you had hundreds of thousands of young people flooding the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other cities across Israel in favor of the government's reform, against the government's reform. And I said, my office, when I was at the Jerusalem Post in Jerusalem, was on Jaffa Street, which is, of course, a very main thoroughfare in the city. And many of those protesters would go past my office window, and I could never tell who was who, because they were all waving Israeli flags and chanting slogans for a better future. And these are the same young people who we had been told for years, had no interest in the future of Israel. We were told all they wanted, these young people, was to get a second passport and move to Berlin and get a tech job somewhere and leave Israel behind. And there they were, week after week, fighting for the future of their country. And after October 7th, those same young people, many of whom were traveling around the world, it was the holiday period, packed onto planes, slept on the floors of El Al jets in order to make it back to Israel, to join their reserve units, to fight and sometimes to die for this country. And the wave of volunteerism that we have seen in the past year, the giving, the contributions, the initiatives that have been started largely by young people, have given me the sense that I'm actually more hopeful about the future of Israel and of Zionism and frankly of the Jewish people after October 7th than I ever was before. The rabbi was talking earlier about increased participation in Jewish life in this very community. I know that's something that's being experienced by Jewish communities around the world. And it gives me this hope that not only will we weather this storm, but we will emerge from it stronger and more resilient than ever before. And it's thanks to the sacrifices of those young people and those who've been actively involved. And it's thanks, quite frankly, to communities like this one who have shown your love and your solidarity and support and continue to do so every single day in countless different ways. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you so much for having me, and let's have a great conversation.
So first, it's very strange to speak with you in person, not behind the gold curtain that I always see on whatever TV station. I'd like to see that room one day.
My living room, yeah.
Okay. You said how we weather the storm, but how do we know when this storm is over, or is this an eternal storm like we heard with the flood? That is the flood coming? Is the flood receding? Is the flood just going to continue? What is that? I know we talked about the day after many times, but when are we moving on next? And that's three fronts, right? Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran.
I imagine that at some point there will be a ceasefire, maybe several ceasefires in the north and the south. I can't imagine the war being considered over until those hostages are brought home. To my mind, we will not be able to start moving forward as a nation. We will not be able to move past this heaviness that we've all felt for the past year and several weeks until all those hostages, alive or dead, are brought home. And I have to say, and I say this with tremendous pain, I don't know that all of them will in fact make it home. I have to imagine that there are some whose bodies are probably buried under rubble and may never be recovered. There are some families that may never have a sense of closure that they so badly need. And so I imagine that to some extent this is a festering wound that will probably remain open so long as they don't have that closure, at least know what happened to their loved ones. But so long as we are able to bring back as many hostages as we possibly can, I think many Israelis have reached the conclusion that needs to be the number one priority. And only once that happens can we consider this war to be over. Does that mean that there won't be ramifications and reverberations? It does not mean that. We know that there will be. While we hope that a lot of the hostility that we've been encountering on college campuses and elsewhere will die down once the war does come to an end, I fear that the goalposts of legitimate conversation on Israel and quite frankly on Jews have been moved, and that we will experience a rhetoric that represents a new normal that is dramatically more hostile towards Jews than it has been in the past. We have the tools to combat that, thanks to some of the folks, some of the organizations represented in this room who are working on campuses and in various other contexts around the country and around the world. We have the tools to fight back, but this is a long-term battle, and it's one that we're all going to have to fight together.
So obviously on our mind is November 5th. There's no endorsement of candidates here, but what does it look like in Israel on November 6th? And what are they thinking as we are sort of sitting in limbo waiting to know what will happen here?
So one of the questions I'm often asked is whether Israelis want Kamala Harris or Donald Trump to win. Public opinion polls seem to suggest that Israelis overwhelmingly favor Donald Trump. But some analysts have expressed caution about another Trump presidency. They have suggested that President Trump views world events through a very personal lens, that he felt personally slighted by Prime Minister Netanyahu when he recognized Joe Biden's victory in the last election. And they wonder whether a next Trump presidency will be quite as positively disposed towards Israel as the last one was. I think it's right for Americans to do what is right for America. And so that should be first and foremost in people's minds when they go to the polling booths on Tuesday. But ultimately, there are many Israelis who feel that the events of the past year have solidified, on the one hand, our gratitude to the United States for standing at our side through thick and thin, but also the need for us to take our fate into our own hands and to develop certain domestic capabilities and capacities that will reduce our dependency even on our best friend, the United States. The incident in which the Biden administration briefly held up a shipment of arms to Israel was quite alarming to many Israelis, who asked the question of whether we should be so fully dependent on another power, no matter how friendly, for our own defense. And so there have been increased calls for developing a domestic weapons development capability. Whether that is a realistic goal is not so clear. We're a very small country. We don't have the same manufacturing capabilities as the United States, but this is a conversation that has, I think, arisen anew in light of October 7th and in light of this war. You asked what happens the day after. Some have suggested that various actors in the region are waiting for the election to do various different things. So a report I read this week, I think in the New York Times, said that certain officials in Iran are holding off on responding to Israel's response so as not to help Donald Trump win the election. Other reports have suggested that Prime Minister Netanyahu is waiting to see who wins the election to advance with some kind of a deal, hoping that perhaps Israel could get better terms under a different president. So there's a great deal of anticipation in Israel, and as I'm sure is the case throughout the region and around the world, to see who the next president will be and what the policies will be towards that part of the world.
So where does journalism fit into this? Because as a rabbi, we get one email from this person, one email from that person. I can put it in this inbox, that inbox, and it says completely the different thing. Whether it's J-Post or Haaretz, whether it's Fox or CNN, whether it's Wall Street Journal or New York Times, it seems like each of us can make our own case based on whatever journalistic path that we are looking at. So how do we dissect that? Or do we just keep to our own TikTok algorithm?
My advice is always to consume news from a variety of sources, to make sure that you are getting a variety of perspectives on the issues of the day. But as someone who ran a newspaper, I think it's primarily our job to report the facts. Free of bias, free of leanings this way or that. I think that's what journalism fundamentally is, trying to get to the truth and convey that to an audience. In parallel, many newspapers, mine included, have an opinion section. That should be where opinions are relegated. Unfortunately, we often see the two bleeding into one another. And many news publications, including some that you just mentioned, have erred in this way over the past year in ways that I find absolutely egregious. And when that happens, I think it's incumbent upon us to call them out. And I know that there are various initiatives to hold journalists to account, to hold journalistic organizations, news organizations to account for their stilted reporting. But those efforts absolutely need to continue. One thing that I tend to caution people about, and this is something that a lot of folks may not think about, is that when you read an article in your local paper, what you're reading often bears little resemblance to what the reporter, him or herself, may have actually written. Because a reporter in, let's say, Jerusalem, may write a certain text and send it to his or her newsroom, wherever that may be. But it then goes through a process of editing, where perhaps it's cut down, perhaps words are removed or added, perhaps it's made to align with a certain style guide. It's placed on the page in a certain way, a photo is added to it, a headline is put on top, a caption is amended, quote perhaps is highlighted in some way, it's tweeted in a certain manner, and that often creates an impression that is dramatically different than that intended by the reporter. And so my advice to folks who are incensed by news reporting they read, and often rightly so, is to hold the newspaper or the media outlet responsible, not the journalist. And I can tell you that oftentimes when I have tweeted about egregious articles that I've seen, I get notes from the journalists who wrote those articles saying, thank you. Wow. Because when I say this to them, they don't listen, but maybe they'll listen to you. Wow. So if you see something that really upsets you, write that letter to the editor. Reach out to editorial boards. Tweet about it if that's a space that you're active in. They take note of it. As someone who received a lot of those letters myself, I can tell you we take note of that and it does make a difference.
So I saw the new data from Boundless, Dr. Rachel Fish and Aviva Klampus, who said between 18 and 40-year-olds, they are only consuming their news on social media. So they only get to all those major publications if it comes across their actual feed. Mm-hmm. If that is the case, and being the top 100 on Twitter first, which is obviously a new title out there over these last couple of years, how do you see the role of journalism in cooperation with social media? Specifically in this Israel field.
Look, social media it's a free-for-all, right? Like, it's one of the most beautiful things about social media is that it's flattened the conversation, that we all have access to the same tools, that my Twitter account has as much potential reach as yours does, or as the New York Times does, and that's remarkable. We're all limited to the same number of characters, and we all have that ability.
Can you share some of your followers with me?
with pleasure. One of the things, though, is that credibility still matters. And when you see a tweet from, for example, the New York Times, that carries certain weight that a tweet from some unnamed activist simply won't carry. And so I don't necessarily agree with the assertion that that the traditional media is no longer relevant because of social media. I think social media can amplify traditional media outlets, but ultimately they come with their own gravitas and their own sort of inherent credibility. What you sometimes see is journalists associated with those reputable names in news engaging in what I would consider activism rather than journalism online, and that I think is unacceptable. Especially if you're relying on those reporters to be talking about these controversial issues in an unbiased and factual and truth-seeking way, to then see them engaging in very clear and overt bias when they are themselves online creates a certain dissonance that we shouldn't have to accept as consumers of journalism. And so again, that's the sort of thing to bring to editors' attention and say, how am I supposed to take your outlet seriously when this is what your reporters are saying online? This is something that we see happening time and time again.
So two last questions, then we'll open up the conversations. One is Iran. We have a large Persian population, not just in LA, but at Sinai Temple. As the former editor of Jerusalem Post, what's your, I don't want to say prophecy or prediction, but sitting on the ground, what's the feeling there in terms of what should happen? And two, we depend on you, but what do you need us to do in this year ahead that you can depend on us?
So on Iran,
the second question is harder, right?
What's that? It is. It's rather challenging. We have seen an escalation in the shadow war between Israel and Iran over the past few months that is extraordinarily dangerous. While we know that Iran has been at war with Israel for decades, covertly, that the Islamic Republic has sent its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various militias in Iraq to engage in Israel in direct and extremely hostile and violent ways, Iran itself has often sort of sat in the background. And that is no longer the case. We have now seen two extraordinary barrages of missiles fired directly from Iran into Israel. And so Israel, of course, had no choice but to respond in some way. And so that's what we saw happen last weekend. We understand again that it was a very effective operation. Now Iran is threatening to retaliate. And while this is, of course, a very dangerous moment, there are some observers who suggested that this is actually Israel's opportunity to finally exercise what is referred to as the military option against Iran's nuclear program. It appears as though Israel heeded American and other countries' advice not to go after Iranian nuclear and oil facilities in its last wave of airstrikes in order to prevent a further escalation of the events. But should Iran retaliate to Israel's retaliation, it appears as though a window will have been open for perhaps exactly such a strike. Now, whether Israel has the capabilities on its own to severely cripple Iran's nuclear program or render it obsolete, I don't know. But there are many who say that this is the moment, that if there is any time for Israel to carry out such an airstrike, this would be the moment where it has the most international credibility and legitimacy to do exactly that. I don't know whether or not that'll happen, but it's something that is certainly possible. I would tend to guess that if Israel does not do that, and possibly even if it does, Iran will eventually develop a nuclear weapon. We understand that it is weeks away from doing exactly that. A senior advisor to Iran's president said this week that it already has the capability to reach that point, but it has chosen not to. If all it takes is a decision by the supreme leader to make that call, I think that that is something that is likely to happen. And that, of course, creates a whole new threat to Israel and to the region and, quite frankly, to the world. In that same interview, I believe, that same advisor to the Iranian president said that Iran is going to expand the range of its ballistic missiles, which means they're not just threatening us, they're threatening all of you. And that makes this an issue that should be foremost on the international agenda, how to contain a potential and an actual nuclear-armed Iran. The fact that we have seen such pussyfooting around this issue, the fact that there have been efforts to appease the Iranian regime, have clearly not produced the results that we so badly need. And I think this requires a significant paradigm shift in how the world approaches this issue. As for what you can do for us, quite frankly, I think it's more of what you've been doing. I spoke earlier about those who have put their feet where their hearts are over the past year and have actually come to Israel. If you have the ability to do that, I would encourage you to do so. It's not so easy these days. There aren't quite as many flights as there generally are because so many airlines aren't flying, but there's still a direct El Al flight from LAX to Tel Aviv. And I'd recommend that you avail yourselves of that opportunity. Israel is still a wonderful place to be, even as all this is going on. I was talking earlier about how we're able to sort of contain these two realities at once. While on the one hand, there is war, if you walk around the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, things often feel pretty normal. And so we've settled into this tragic, but I think essential wartime routine. And if you are able to be there at our side, of course, we would love for you to do so. But there are ways of expressing solidarity and support from here. We were talking earlier about some of the organizations that have been featured by this congregation, others that will be coming. They're doing critical life-saving work in Israel, supporting those families who've been evacuated, those businesses who are suffering, those Israelis who have lost loved ones over the past year. One thing I think that is often neglected, and I don't think is enough a part of the conversation, is the mental health aspect of this war. When I talk about a society that's experiencing PTSD, I think we haven't even started to understand the scope of that. the army has actually, in its wisdom, started processing sessions for units that come out of Gaza to prevent PTSD from setting in, and that's tremendously important. But when I think about the circles of Israelis who are experiencing various different levels of trauma just by living in Israel, children who are forced to run to bomb shelters because there are Iranian missiles flying overhead, I fear for the future. I fear for what will be 5-10 years down the line when those kids do or might develop some form of PTSD. And I think if you can help the sort of mental health resilience of Israel at this time, that is something that we are going to need very badly over the next few years. But at the end of the day, what you're already doing is so deeply and critically important. And I can only express gratitude for everything that you've been doing and everything that you will do to support us during this time.
So we'll be journalistic and not do the op-ed sections, but do the Q&A section. So if you have a question, then Amanda will come with the microphone. We'll do Larry.
First, do you think the world really cares enough to confront Iran? The world. I mean, we know the democracies, we know not this and that. Does the world really care enough to do something? And secondly, how do you tie the Ukrainian war with the Israeli issue, and where does all that fit now, in your opinion?
So I'd actually answer those two questions in one, because Iran has played a role in the war in Ukraine as well. We know that Iran has provided Russia with the drones and some of the missiles and other armaments that it has utilized against the people of Ukraine. And the fact that the world doesn't make that connection, even though it's clear and they've said so openly, I think is an indication that we need to be doing more to, A, connect those issues. By the way, the president of Ukraine has said many times that he feels a sense of solidarity with Israel, not just because he's Jewish, but because he realizes that we are under attack by similar forces that are trying to undo our very existence. And I don't expect the world writ large to care about Iran, right? There are many countries that are actually probably happy about Iran developing a nuclear weapon, including some of its allies that are world powers on the other side of this equation. But I do expect Western powers, democracies, as you mentioned, those who have been so steadfastly supportive of Ukraine during its war with Russia, to start seeing the bigger picture. There is a realignment going on amongst world powers, and we are on one side, and Iran is on the other side. And it is, I think, incumbent upon those who care about our collective democratic values and a peaceful future for mankind to stand against the specter of a nuclear Iran and do whatever they can, including, if necessary, military action to prevent that threat from developing into reality.
Avi, thank you for being here. My main question is, circling back to Israel media, what's your view of Israel closing down Al Jazeera, certain Al Jazeera offices? And then if you want to spend a moment on this, I didn't hear it mentioned earlier, but how did you lose your thick Israeli accent? Where did you grow up? What brought you to Israel?
Okay. Well, that one's easy. I was born in the States. My family made it out when I was a kid. I've been back and forth my entire life, and so we were always an English-speaking home, and I actually am often more comfortable expressing myself in English than I am in Hebrew. I did not agree with Israel's decision to shut down Al Jazeera. By the way, not only did they shut down the physical office of Al Jazeera in Israel, but you cannot access Al Jazeera's website from Israel anymore unless you go through a VPN. I think that there are other ways to deal with hostile media by exposing their lies, by pushing back, by confronting them live on the air, as I and many others do on a regular basis. I think that shutting down a media outlet sends a chilling message about the resilience of Israeli democracy and freedom of expression and freedom of the press in Israel. And repugnant and repulsive as I often find Al Jazeera's reporting to be, I think that not enabling them to be a part of the conversation sends a message of almost intimidation, that we're not comfortable confronting their lies, that we'd rather shut them out of the conversation entirely for whatever reason that may be. And I don't believe that to be the case. I think we have compelling answers to all of the lies that they promulgate, and I think that shutting them down was ultimately far more harmful than beneficial in any way.
Marshall, we'll get to you, I promise.
Thank you for a great presentation. I wonder if you could give us your evaluation of Netanyahu's future in Israeli politics, whether there'll be an election before 2026, who the principal opposition would be, and what you think their chances are.
So, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been eulogized many, many times, and he keeps rising again like a phoenix out of the ashes. His approval ratings prior to October 7th were quite low, largely due to the intense debate in Israel over the judicial reform, with which many Israelis very fervently disagreed. And his approval ratings suffered in the aftermath of October 7th, because of October 7th and the failures that were evident that day, and due to his personal failure to take any responsibility for those failures. That was viewed and continues to be viewed by many Israelis as a failure in leadership, that the leaders of Israel's defense establishment, the military, the security agencies of all various kinds have themselves said, we bear some responsibility for the failures of October 7th, but that Netanyahu himself has not done so is not received well by a majority of Israelis. At the same time, I think his coalition is actually fairly stable at the moment and continues getting more and more stable. You may know that recently Gideon Sa'ar, one of his bitterest rivals in the Knesset, joined the coalition, giving it even more breathing room. For the simple fact that most of the parties in the coalition recognize that they will only suffer if they bring down the government and force an election. They will either end up in the opposition or they'll end up outside the Knesset altogether. And so, strictly out of self-interest, I think that his coalition will likely stay together, which means that he will almost certainly guarantee himself a full term. I would argue that that gives him the leeway that he needs to make some difficult decisions. Knowing that his coalition is actually likely to stay intact, he can, for example, engage in some kind of painful agreement with Hamas to release the hostages. Even though members of his own coalition have threatened to bring it down or threatened to bolt, I don't actually think they will. And the Prime Minister is a very cautious man, which, by the way, runs counter to his international image. He will not do anything to endanger his coalition, but I think if he counts the votes, he will realize that he actually does have the majority he needs. And by the way, others in the opposition have said that if those coalition members leave, they will step in order to enable such a deal to proceed. I'll say that my perspective on this has changed somewhat over the past few months. I used to go on the air with CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and all the others and defend the Prime Minister's decision to keep negotiations going, not to sign a deal, explaining the legitimate security concerns inherent in releasing thousands of Palestinian terrorists, looking at the example of Yahya Sinwar, who himself was released in the Gilad Shalit deal and of course went on to be the mastermind and commander of the October 7th massacre. And I think it was, quite frankly, the recovery of the body of Hersh Goldberg Poland and the 5 other hostages that have convinced me that there is no priority greater than bringing those hostages home. And while the security concerns remain real, I find it difficult to breathe when I think about the fact that there's still 101 people being held in Hamas captivity. And as Jews, the mitzvah of pidyon shvuim, of redeeming captives, is so supremely important. To my mind, this is an immediate matter of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives. And I think many Israelis would agree, and I think the Prime Minister actually does have the the political ability to do that, and I find it confusing that he hasn't yet done so.
Thank you for your presentation, Avi. Israel's policy vis-a-vis Hamas is to destroy it as a military and governing force so it can no longer threaten Israel. What are Israel's objectives as to Hezbollah? What does it want to achieve up there?
It's very straightforward. I mean, Israel has said from day one, all it needs up north is quiet. It needs its residents to be able to live in their homes in peace and quiet and not live under threat of Hezbollah missile and rocket attacks. So Israel's objective, which by the way it had said it's willing and happy to pursue diplomatically until it was forced to respond militarily, is to push Hezbollah northward past what's called the Litani River, where it's not supposed to be. It's not even supposed to be where it is now. That's a failure of the United Nations. But to push it past the Litani River and ensure that that entire region is demilitarized so that it simply cannot pose a threat to northern Israel. That is the most basic priority that Israel has when it comes to Hezbollah. In the meantime, Israel has taken the opportunity posed by these ongoing attacks by Hezbollah and the need to respond to them to decimate Hezbollah's military capabilities. The last estimate I saw, I think this week, is that Hezbollah's drone capabilities have been reduced by 80%, that its missile capabilities have been decimated by more than half. And of course, its entire military leadership has been eliminated, continues to be eliminated when new commanders are appointed. So I think that sends a very powerful message. I hope that this offers the opportunity for some kind of diplomatic resolution, which we understand is in the works to push Hezbollah north and ensure that Israelis are able to return to their homes. And quite frankly, I hope that not only for Israel, but for Lebanon. I think Hezbollah has held Lebanon hostage for years. Lebanon has essentially become an Iranian vassal state. It has been decimated economically. The only party in Israel, in Lebanon that's benefiting from the current situation is Hezbollah and its patron Iran. And I think that the weaker Hezbollah is, the more Lebanon will be able to thrive and hopefully at some point even pursue good neighborly relations with Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Over the last year, we've seen how the IDF has come back strongly after October 7th. And also, we know that it's been very powerful. Now, this all takes money. And also, we've seen how Israelis in the north have been moved temporarily for their own safety. This also takes a lot of money. How is the Israeli economy holding up throughout this?
With great difficulty. The war costs an estimated billion shekel per day. And when you couple that with the effect that this has had on various sectors of the Israeli economy, the tech sector, for example, many of whose employees have been called up for reserve duty and have not been in their places of work for a year or more. The tourism sector, which has been completely decimated over the past year. Small businesses, many of which have collapsed because they simply don't have the personnel because they're either in reserve duty or they've been moved around due to the circumstances. Israel's economy is suffering. And the fact that credit rating agencies have lowered Israel's credit rating recently means that Israel will struggle to attract foreign capital and foreign investments to rebuild. Now, the Prime Minister has said that Israel has bounced back from wars in the past and it'll do so again. But Israel's never had a war that has extended this long and that has affected Israeli society in such a profound way. And so I am concerned about what Israel's economic prospects are in the future. There are many who've suggested that Israel will be forced to engage in budget cuts to those things that are deemed non-essential. And now there is a debate over what those things may be. There are certain communities in Israel that receive certain benefits that would likely have to be cut in the context of such a broad budget cut and a tightening of belts. They obviously don't want to lose those benefits, and so they're pushing back and, again, threatening to bring down the government. But I think it's incumbent upon all Israelis to rise to the occasion and realize that certain sacrifices will have to be made in order to ensure our economic resilience and our ability to bounce back from this terrible war.
Ask the group the question, and then we'll do it together. So, Joseph?
I've heard this, repeated many times, that even if Israel, in regards to Hamas, kills all the soldiers and all the ideology will survive, and that it will regenerate itself after the war. So all of this will be for naught. How do you feel about that?
So I posed that question to, shall we say, a very senior Israeli official, and his response was, we're not fighting an ideology, we're fighting a military organization. And I think that from his perspective, that is true, and he has certain military objectives that he feels Israel and the IDF need to pursue. But I would tend to agree that if you don't do something about the ideology, it is not unlikely that something like Hamas will reemerge at some point in the not too distant future. And so many observers have suggested that what needs to happen in Gaza after this war comes to an end is a process not dissimilar to what happened in Germany after World War II with the denazification program. There will have to be a de-radicalization of Gaza and, quite frankly, of Palestinian society that sees a total reform of their education system, their religious institutions, their state-run media, that ensures that they're not teaching their children the kind of virulent hate and bigotry that have characterized so much of Palestinian society in recent decades and have generated a reality where not only was Hamas active on October 7th, but much of Palestinian society was either involved directly or supportive of the massacre of that day. So I think that is a critical component that should be a part of any day after plan. I know that it is being discussed at certain different levels, and I hope that that's actually what will happen.
Two more questions, 1 and 2, or 3.
Hey, how do you view the UN and its role in this conflict, and especially moving forward, like what do you see its role in the conflict?
The UN has played a deeply toxic role in this conflict, and particularly over the past year. Certain UN bodies, most notably UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, which is the UN agency that is solely dedicated to the needs of the Palestinians, has been directly implicated in various aspects of the massacre of October 7th and the war. We know that several of its employees have been found to have engaged in the massacre, perpetrating it themselves. Others have held hostages in their homes. We know that the head of the UNRWA Teachers Union in Lebanon, for example, was also the head of Hamas in Lebanon, and he was recently taken off the scene by an Israeli airstrike. And so I can't imagine a body like UNRWA ever playing a constructive role in Gaza or in the region, which is why I tend to support calls for UNRWA's dissolution and replacement with a constellation of bodies that already exist. There already is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Why does there need to be a separate agency just for Palestinians? You know, there are humanitarian agencies within the UN that know how to deal with challenging circumstances like those that exist in Gaza. Why do we need this designated body that exists only for one place? This expertise exists in other bodies, and so if the UN wants to play a constructive role, it has the ability to do so, but only once UNRWA is taken off the scene.
Last 2 questions.
Thank you so much. Do you think the time has come for the Jews all around the world to learn the self-defense techniques, and especially we start in our schools, in synagogues, to teach our youngsters the technique of self-defense? I believe that even Israel defeats
Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, still we cannot defeat the ideology of Islam. So I think we should be prepared how to defend ourselves.
The question is whether it's incumbent upon Jews around the world to learn self-defense, to protect themselves in light of those who might threaten them. I think it's probably not a bad idea for people to know how to defend themselves from all sorts of threats and potential attackers, whether anti-Semitic or otherwise. And if you have the resources locally or elsewhere for young people to learn how to respond to physical attacks, I think that that's not a bad idea for people to do. But we shouldn't need that. We should demand of our local authorities that they keep us safe. We should be demanding that police and other law enforcement authorities keep their fingers on the pulse of extremism on college campuses, online, in our communities, so that we don't get to the point where Jews have to be out there with brass knuckles defending themselves against those who are physically attacking them, whether in Los Angeles or elsewhere. The fact that we have gotten to that point on college campuses where Jews are being physically accosted and administrations are standing by and refusing to call in the National Guard or other law enforcement institutions because they don't want to escalate matters is egregious. And it is absolutely unacceptable that we have allowed our authorities to sit at the sidelines and fail to protect the Jewish community. So yes, I think we should learn how to protect ourselves, but ultimately it is for our local authorities to do that for us. And only as a last resort should we have the ability to fend off attacks should they come.
One last question. I have an important announcement at the end.
Thank you, Avi. The question is about southern Lebanon and northern Israel. If Hezbollah were to go north of Litani River, would it be safe for the Jews to return to northern Israel?
It would be safer. We know that many of Hezbollah's long-range missiles are further north, but those have not generally been the ones that have posed the greatest immediate threat to the residents of northern Israel. Those have been mostly the shorter range rockets and mortars that are fired from southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River. And so Israel has said that should southern Lebanon in that area be free of the threat posed by Hezbollah, that it could in fact enable residents of northern Israel to return to their homes. And I can tell you, they want to so badly. There are so many residents of kibbutzim and moshavim and towns up north who have stealthily gone back to check on their homes and who are just praying for the day when they can take their kids out of their temporary schools and move out of their temporary homes and go back to the places where they belong. So I think that should Hezbollah be pushed north towards, past the Litani River, that would be a sign that it is finally safe for them to return home.
Any closing statement? I know we covered a lot of ground from all around the world, Israel, America, Iran, Lebanon.
Just that as dispiriting as the past year has been and as painful it has been for so many of us, I find so many points of light in some of the dynamics and developments that I've mentioned earlier, the resilience of Israeli society, the sense of unity and solidarity that we've experienced from folks like all of you, and the remarkable, remarkable sacrifices and contributions of young people, both in Israel and Jews around the world, that I hope you emerge from this as hopeful as I am, and as optimistic about the future of Israel and the Jewish people, because I really do find that I'm much more hopeful and optimistic about that future in the past year than I ever have been before.
It's a wonderful note to conclude on. Avi Mayer, thank you. And I always give everybody a next step. So I just found out yesterday that who this next person I'm going to mention has been here before, but Bernard Henry Levy, who's been here multiple times, he's actually decided to do a campus tour immediately. And so he's going to be at UCLA and USC on Monday, USC at 4 p.m., UCLA at 7:30 p.m. If you know a student or if you know yourself, it's not just for students, for everybody, to please try to attend. You can email me and I can send you the Google form. It's free. He's giving out his book, Israel Alone. Again, it's 7:30 down the street at UCLA Hillel. At USC, it's at the Chabad. And then he is crisscrossing the country through November 13th. And one of the calls they made was to here to make sure that we get it out to our students and community as well. So,
I'm the after party, by the way. He's speaking at 4. I think I'm speaking at 6 at Hillel at
USC?
UCLA. Yeah, UCLA,
No.
right.
Oh no, you're before that, right? Before. He's
I think-
7:30 UCLA.
Oh, great, even better.
Even
So
better. Warm him up.
I'm the warm-up act.
If you want Avi Mayer, more Avi Mayer, 6 o'clock, UCLA Hillel, Bernard Henry Levy. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.